Well, thank you, everybody. I admire your optimism. After that introduction, I was thinking a little bit about the Ideas in American Policing lecture series, and I'm going to be talking about harm-focused policing, which brings a number of things that people have already been working on in some areas, but the idea of this is to try and coalesce them into a little bit of a better sense of what I'm trying to talk about. I mean, of course, David is one of the most senior scholars in the field, and I look back through the history of other people who've given them Ideas in American Policing lectures. And some of those ideas you're going to see coming through in this. And what I want to do to start you off in terms of thinking, to set the scene to some degree of what I'm talking about, is I want to show you a photograph and then talk through a couple of examples about how challenging this might be. And I was very much drawn to this photograph. It's taken by a guy called Joe Kaczmarek, who started as a photojournalist, who started an organization in Philadelphia that wanted to highlight and draw attention to the problem of gun violence in the city and maintain a focus on shootings and violence. And late one night, one evening, in a summer's evening, at the scene of a shooting and a homicide in North Philadelphia, he caught this lovely moment between the police officer and this little girl. And part of the Ideas in American Policing series is to think about what the future might look like. And while we focus so much on shooting and violence, and we should do, I thought about what the future held for this little girl. And the reality is that while her mother is probably rightly worried about her being the victim of shooting and being the victim of a violent crime, there are many other harms that police can have an impact on that she's much more likely to be a victim of. So while we may worry about shootings, it's much more likely that her home could get broken into, that her mum's car could be stolen. When she's walking to go and catch the bus to school, she's going to have to learn which corners to avoid, because that's where the drug guys hang out in the morning and sell heroin. And she's got to be careful around there because the heroin addicts, when they don't get their perks fixed in the morning, can be a little antsy. And she has to be careful about who she sits next to on the school bus because of bullying. And where she goes at school, because she has to avoid the unwanted attentions of the sexual advances of boys in school. And when she comes home, perhaps the same thing about her mum's new boyfriend. And she'll be more likely than violence to be a victim or a witness to domestic violence and domestic abuse. And so to avoid that, she might go down to the corner store and go down to the bodega. But she has to be careful walking up the road, because late in the afternoon she'll have to learn who on the block has behavioral health problems and sometimes forgets to take their medication late in the afternoon and can be unpredictable. When she gets to the bodega, she'll pay more than she has to, because the violent street gang that operate in that area are extorting money from the corner store. And she won't get what she paid for anyway, because they do a roaring trade in counterfeit goods. And on the way out of the store, on the way home, she'll have to be careful crossing the road because of speeding cars and drunk drivers, and because of ATVs that are driven up and down by young men with no license and no insurance. And she'll have to be careful crossing the road because of the broken pavement and the cracks in the sidewalk, because the money that was supposed to go for infrastructure protection and infrastructure management was actually siphoned off by corrupt politicians and labor unions. When she gets a little bit older, she might have a car. She'll pay more for insurance for a whole bunch of reasons. She'll get a job. Her 401k won't perform as well as it could have done because of corrupt business practices and insider trading. And when she gets a house, she'll probably pay more interest than she really needs to because of fraudulent lending practices. All these are harms that she's much more likely to be a victim of. But we focus very much on violent crime. And in terms of thinking about the role for the police here, he's going to have to help deal with all of these things and help manage these harms for this little girl, because these are going to have an impact on her in a variety of ways, not just her physical health, but it's going to have an impact on her in terms of her emotional health. Her belief and trust in government and the institutions of government, and all those things will have an impact on her sense of almost cultural safety. So I thought about the role for the police officer for the next 10, 15 years. And I want you to believe the hype. And this confirms probably to David, who always suspected I was just a cop from the East End of London with delusions of grandeur and really was illiterate. But I have spelt that correctly, because thinking about what the role of policing is moving forward, I think that role to some degree is a range of things we've seen here before. But I think policing is moving into a stage where it should be harm-focused, intelligence-led, problem-oriented, and evidence-based. And moving from the bottom up, There's a strong history of evidence-based promotion and work with David and other people here at the Police Foundation. And obviously Larry Sherman's one of the driving forces behind that, and this was his Ideas in American Policing lecture. Problem-oriented policing has, while it's not, it's been around for 30 years and it's not the new exciting thing on the block, there is a massive amount of evidence and research evidence that supports this as an effective strategy to reduce crime and disorder in communities and neighborhoods. Intelligence-led, and I believe in that because there are still people out in the communities, there's still that hardcore of serious, violent, repeat offenders that really deserve our love and attention. And it's not, so I really believe that, and it's not just because my book, Intelligence-Led Policing, I'm bringing out a second edition at probably the end of the year. Intelligence-Led Policing, available from all good booksellers and your online retailers. And then harm-focused policing. And harm seeks to, what I'm trying to say with this is that we need to think about measuring more things than just crime. There are other aspects of life that we can now, with large data sets, think about bringing in to make a more holistic picture of all the community harms that the public are vulnerable to. But there has some challenges, so I want to give you some stories, a couple of stories as an example. Many years ago, I ran away from home as a 17-year-old, just 17, about to turn 18. Ran away from Glasgow in Scotland and went to London to join the police as a cadet and then as a sworn officer. Why did I join the police? Because the circus wasn't in town. But there were similarities I discovered quite quickly. After working with the public and a few senior officers, I learned that in both fields you do spend a time with quite a few clowns and the occasional bearded lady. One of the first things I was tasked to do when I went on the streets of East London, and I was posted to Limehouse District, the older H District in East London, in Tower Hamlets. At the time it was the most deprived borough in England and Wales, and probably still is. And one of the first jobs I was given was to go out to one of the many public housing projects and to guard the crime scene at Homicide. And it was in buildings very much similar to this, a style of architecture here near Chris Street Market in the East End of London, aptly described as brutalist. Open walkways between apartments. And these sorts of places are where you end up with the unemployed poor or the working poor, or immigrant families tend to predominate in these places. And it was there that a homicide had taken place. There were two families that lived next door to each other. The 15-year-old girl in one house had taken quite a shine to the 16-year-old boy who lived next door. And when both the families were out, she invited him round and they consummated their love, as was the style at the time. Their timing, however, was terrible. Even though it was voluntary and consensual, unfortunately her brothers and her family arrived home and found the young couple in flagrante. And one thing led to another, and coming from a part of the world where family honor was very important and honor killings were not unheard of, the brothers, the older brothers of this girl, decided to punish the young man by separating him from his offending organ with a kitchen knife. He managed to escape the apartment but collapsed outside and subsequently died. And I still to the day remember the crime scene photographs in the crime scene. A typical teenage girl's bedroom. She shared that bedroom with one of her younger sisters. And it's strewn with clothes and toys. And rather like a sort of macabre Where's Waldo, to use a Scottish euphemism there on the floor is Where's Willie. So what we have here is a particularly gruesome crime, but likely only one, essentially a unique one-off event to some degree. Not far, and it's a difficult place to really investigate. But not far from here was another housing project. And it was separated pretty much from the rest of the community by a freeway, an approach to one of the tunnels under the Thames, the Blackwall Tunnel Northern Approach. And so for the people in that housing project to get to the other side of the Blackwall Tunnel Northern Approach and to get to the subway station, the tube station, they had to pass through an underpass, not dissimilar to this. And we had a young man who would regularly, you'll understand now what the link is in my stories here, he would regularly take a shine to young ladies walking through and reveal himself and masturbate in front of them. And every time he did this, we would go and arrest him. Because what his MO would be to do was to go and unscrew all the light fittings, remove the lights until it was completely dark. And you're wondering, surely that must defeat the purpose. As we explained to him every time we got a report of this and we went to arrest him, yes, some young men do this, but you're the only one who paints his penis luminous green. And he's down in this darkened subway station waving that thing around as like his own personal lightsaber. Now, serious, I grant you. As serious as the previous crime? No. But herein lies the problem. He was very prolific at this. He was doing this all the time. And week in, week out for years. And it was finally solved by a very smart guy from Bow Street Police Station's Community Policing Unit who figured out a problem-oriented policing solution, which was to get the council to repair all of the lights and then seal them with non-returning screws. And by simply removing the opportunity for the luminous paint to have its effect, it essentially removed his interest in doing that crime. But until we did that, he was incredibly prolific. And I suspect in the long term, while the homicide was obviously incredibly serious, the amount of time and effort and harm to the community was probably more serious with him over time than with the homicide. So finding ways to think about merging these types of crime and working them together is quite serious and a challenge. And I was thinking about this as I was putting together some thoughts on the demand gap in US policing. What you see here is stretching from 1960 through to essentially 2013 is the relative change index from 1960 in the number of police officers available to work in the United States. And you can see that there's 100%, 200%, nearly a threefold increase in the number of police officers from 1960 to 2013. But what you see here in the back is the demand gap, because this is the relative change in the amount of crime, UCR crime. And what you see is this huge gap between available police resources and the demand for those police services just based on crime alone. And it's something interesting that in the 1980s and the 1990s, when we had thoughts about intelligence-led policing and problem-oriented policing, it's probably not a coincidence that they emerged as ideas at a time when crime was going up and demand for policing and crime prevention was going up, at a time when police weren't able, the growth of police didn't match that need. What's interesting is that they're coming together and they're starting to merge a little bit more. The demand gap is finally closing. And so at least at a superficial level, you might think that this is an argument for perhaps the need for fewer police resources. But in actual fact, I don't think that that's the case, but I think the nature of policing has changed. If we look back over the last 25 years, just in one area, mental health spending and spending to treat people with behavioral health issues, what you can see here is over the last 25, 30 years since 1986, the amount, the percentage spending that we're spending as a nation in terms of mental health and behavioral health care on inpatient residential care has dropped in half. And people are seeing that with the increase in mental health issues and behavioral health issues in prison. But people don't get to prison directly. They have to go through the criminal justice system, and they enter that system with the police. But even if they don't enter the criminal justice system, we're seeing a need for increased thoughts about how police deal with people with behavioral health issues. Because where is all this spending going? If it's not going on inpatient and residential, it doesn't seem to be going on outpatient spending. Instead, it's going on retail prescription drugs. A massive increase in spending and the relative spending in retail prescription drugs. So what we see here is a shift in supervision from people who are trained and skilled in this area to supervision on the street and supervision in the community. And that's where this shift has taken place in terms of policing. And it's not been a very successful experiment. What we end up with, as we look over since 1990, the number of poisoning by drugs death rate has not been well controlled. And it's essentially doubled and tripled over that period. It's been a very much a failed experiment. So now what we have is a change in the nature of what policing is about. But then I thought about that a little bit more and thought, was it ever just about crime? So I decided to rip off a slide from Sir Hugh Orde out of the UK and just for a moment thought about what are some of the tasks that we ask of police. And there's a whole range of them here, ranging from crime to cyber stalking. That's relatively new, but there are some things that have been around forever, such as public drunkenness and vandalism. Some new things that we really didn't need to worry about before, such as airport security and bomb scares, the management of sex offenders and event security, everything down here from medical assistance to building collapses. And especially when I see in the UK there's talk about reducing the funding and spending for policing, I think that's fine. It's the prerogative of government to do so. But if you want to do so, which of these tasks are you going to take away? Which of these would you like to do without? And if so, who's going to do it? I organise these in a particular way because I think they say something about what the role of policing is and why this is relevant to thinking about harm more generally than just specific crime. Over on the right-hand side here in red, you see some of the traditional and relatively some of the new things that we have to worry about. Violent crime, narcotics, child abuse and property crime are very much traditional policing roles. Counter-terrorism is relatively new, and so is cyberstalking. In brown in the middle here, these are really activities that you could consider to be sort of surveillance, just keeping an eye on things, making sure everything's okay. In the darker color down here at the bottom, you have disorder, quality of life type areas. But here you essentially just have sort of harm prevention. These are community maintenance type activities. And there's a whole wealth of these that police do that help maintain the flow and the legitimacy of government and also help maintain that sort of community social structure. If we're going to reduce money for policing, which of these are we going to ask the police to stop doing? And that becomes relevant now then thinking about what do we ask police to do and how do we assess them? Here at a ComStat meeting or a crime strategy briefing in Philadelphia, it's well seen that above the top of the room, what gets measured gets done. And so what are police assessed on? What is the benchmark by which we assess many police departments, especially urban police departments? Well, that benchmark tends to be homicide, doesn't it? Homicide, especially when not just surveillance by government and by the mayor's office and by the police commissioner, but by the fourth estate and the role of the media. Here we're all worried that Philly's murder rate was skyrocketing in 2014. Seemed a little bit of an adventurous claim, given that it was written about 14 days after the beginning of the year. We actually finished the last year with pretty much exactly the same homicide rate as we had to start with, but you have to admire the what as somebody said, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. So I thought, well, okay, how much of an issue is homicide? If we're assessing the police department and the health, really this is what we're talking about here, harm is about the health of the city, how much of police time, patrol time especially, is taken up by homicides? So I took all of the incidents. Philadelphia has an incident database. And in that incident database, it's not all calls for service, but calls for service that take up some police time or have been found by the police to be an incident that needs care and attention. In other words, anything the police actually spend time doing becomes an incident. There are quite a few of them, about 1.6 million. I've got all 100% in these 100 boxes here. And homicide takes up, ready for this? That much. There you go. Did you see it? That's it, just down there. That is that on the strength of the response to that much, police chiefs lose their job or, may get promoted or more salary, promoted from police chief. So like, well, okay, that's not a lot. There seems to be an awful lot of other things the police department do. So I thought, well, I'll add in all the other Part 1 violent crime, the rapes, the robberies, and so forth. Any guesses to how much that takes up?
Like one box?
It fills up one box. Yep, that's it. There is all the serious violent crime. That's the full activity of the Philadelphia Police Department for 1 year. That is all the serious violent crime down there. All right, so I thought, well, blimey, what's the rest of it? I'll add in the burglaries, the vehicle thefts, all the rest of Part 1. The full totality of Part 1 crime doesn't even take up half of the bottom row. So I got to the stage of looking at Part 2 crime. I pulled out the guns and all the narcotics incidents. Well, that didn't take up very much either. It took up there, that much. Domestic disturbances and domestic disputes. Well, that took up, and we're still not off the bottom row at this point. Still not off the bottom row. So where are we? All the minor assaults, the disturbances, and all the other crimes managed to fill up, all of that together fills up 20% of all the incidents in the Philadelphia Police Department as a fairly demonstrative city that many places will be under. So I started looking at this community maintenance, this community harm prevention. And this is all the things that's checking premises. Hey, there's a guy that looks a bit suspicious. There's a car that's been outside my home for 3 weeks. There's an alarm going off somewhere. I don't see anything going on, but can you come and check it out? All those kind of things that help glue society, that pulling together of all, something's going on that shouldn't be going on that somebody should come and do something about. That takes up a whole decent chunk of police time. Miscellaneous radio calls, that takes up about 3%. Radio calls that police have to attend that in the end there's really nothing going on, that takes up a huge amount of time as well. I add in here traffic accidents and traffic enforcement. Any idea how much that takes up? Not actually as much as I thought. That actually takes up just 5%. Of police activity. Then dealing with quality of life and vulnerable people, missing persons, dealing with truancy, dealing with absconders, all those kinds of things, that takes up a chunk of time. Now, I have to throw in a caveat. Philadelphia make a separate record for all of their pedestrian investigations. Pedestrian stops are where a police officer will stop somebody and speak to them and ask them some questions. It could, but not all the time, end up with a Terry stop and a frisk, and in some cases it could end up with a search. But they kind of double count. So when you're seeing these here, the pedestrian stops that are shown here, if they end up with a drug arrest, they'll be counted twice. So they'll be counted here and counted in the drugs. If they end up with find an illegal firearm, they'll be counted twice. And the same thing for traffic stops. But over you can see in this mosaic of how much is taking place. What we're really looking at is violent crime and serious crime take up a tiny proportion of the work of the police department. And that makes it difficult to benchmark departments in terms of the sorts of harms that the community worry about. If you think about what the community worry about, they worry about all this stuff because this is what they're calling about. But we set benchmarks and assess police departments and criteria for success based on these tiny couple of boxes down here on the right-hand side. Now, I know other people have thought about this, and a few years ago with Jim Shepchicki, who's up in York University in Canada, we wrote about, in terms of strategic criminal intelligence, that a strategic harm approach will be one that looked for priorities for intelligence gathering and analysis based on notions of the social harm caused by different sorts of criminal activity. So to give you a demonstration of this, I'd like to talk you through 3 projects where we've been thinking about, in Philadelphia and with the FBI nationally, been thinking about measuring different activities in different ways to think about harm and making better use as an assessment tool of the different types of data that police departments actually have. Now, people have done this already. There's been a long history for a couple of decades, for example, of costs of crime research. A good example is the work of Paul Heaton, very nice work from the Rand Institute a few years ago. It's a really good example of it, pulled together a lot of research, but it demonstrates to me a couple of problems. Firstly, we're looking at depending on the methods that you have, well, we have very different estimates. If you just look at homicide, anywhere between $5 and $11 million is the societal cost of a homicide. Paul Heaton came up with an average of $8.6 million. But there's a little bit of small print here I'm going to read to you. It says, arson is also Part 1 crime, but has typically been excluded from cost of crime studies due to its rarity. Well, that's great if you want to compare cities. But if we want to use this at a much more micro level, if you want to use this as a way of thinking about crime and harm in small communities and crime hotspots, then these very broad categories are not helpful. You ask any cop on the street, and there are robberies and there are robberies. A rich person having their iPhone stolen is very different than somebody getting, a bank robbery or an armed robbery, or somebody an old person losing their life savings. There are all sorts of, within each of these very broad categories, there's a whole range of different types of harm. So try and counter that. Picked up some work that Larry Sherman was doing, who suggested thinking about using sentencing guidelines. And as Larry wrote, in terms of sentencing guidelines, when crimes on the basis of sentencing guidelines can be justified on good democratic grounds, as reflecting the will of the people, it remains far closer to the will of the people than any theoretical or even empirical system of weighting that academics might develop. I would also add another advantage to it here. is if we're going to use this as a way to think about benchmarking harms in communities, or even benchmarking the effectiveness of police in crime hotspots and local areas, it has an additional advantage of being an objective third-party measure. It's not one generated and thought of by the police as a way to assess their own behavior. So it has some objective external validity. All right, so what can we do with it? Well, fortunately, I've discovered that one way to look at the sentencing guidelines, we've had this in Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania, since about 1982, is a set of sentencing guidelines. And rather than the cost of crime you saw, they're much more thorough. There's actually what they call an offense gravity score. It's in this column here, and it applies to absolutely every single crime or every single offense on the statute books in the state of Pennsylvania. So I thought, well, that's great. Maybe we can use the offense gravity score. I wondered how many are. It can't be that many. Well, actually, there was a few, I grant you. It took a while to go through. Amber Prenton, my graduate researcher at the back of the room, and I. Actually, we ended up going through all the UCR crimes that are recorded by the police department. There's more. I figured I would stop at that point in case people started to get ill. We went through all the UCR crimes, and we looked for the most appropriate offence and assigned it an offence gravity score. But to make sure it wasn't generated just by academics, we also brought in a couple of analysts from the police department and a couple of patrol officers. So we got that mix of analysis, academic, and street policing. And when there were disagreements, we essentially pooled and discussed and came up with values. So what we were able to do is to tie all of the UCR crimes to an offence gravity score. And to give you a sense of them, the offence gravity scores run from 1 all the way through to 14. These are just some example crimes that you can see here that give you a sense of the type of activity that would largely be associated with that offence gravity score. Here's how we might want to use this. Here's an example police division. This is 10 years worth of real data from a police division in Philadelphia. And what we see here is this is all the Part 1 crime. This is all the Part 1 crime for 10 years. You can see there's a degree of seasonality to it, where all the Part 1 crime is not the count of crime, but it's the count with, it's the weighting of that code. So, for example, the homicides would be rated 14 on the offence gravity score. The lower Part 1 crimes would have a lower number. Yep. So we can weigh crime that way. Nice. Well, we can also include in that Part 2 crime. This is all the Part 2 crime added on to that. And you can see that in terms of if we include this as a harm and all the Part 2 crime is weighted according to its offence gravity score, for this police district we actually see a general reduction in harm over a 10-year period. We can also do something else here, because the offence gravity score has offences for DUI and it has a cost for causing traffic accidents and those types of things. So we can now add in a weighting for traffic accidents and vehicle-related issues. Now our measure of harm is not just about crime, Part 1 crime, Part 2 crime, but also traffic. And now we're building a collective sense of harm in the community, the types of harms that that little girl might have to face. Crossing the road, walking to the corner, going to the bodega. Now things get a little bit more interesting because, and I'm sure in this room, I'm not sure how well this idea is going to go down, probably about as popular as a veal steak in a vegan restaurant. But there probably isn't much doubt that recent events on the television, recent events around the country have highlighted that excessive amounts of some types of police activity are perceived by the community to be harmful. Of course, I'm talking about things such as stop and frisk. Now, notwithstanding the evidence from things like the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment that found that there were significant reductions in violent crime, up to 23%, in violent crime hotspots, and that was correlated with increases in pedestrian stops and traffic stops. But I think most people would agree that there is a perception of harm amongst some communities when there are excessive and unconstrained applications of some type of policing. This is a metric then that could be useful in terms of providing some sort of constraint on how we use tactics and how we think about crime reduction in communities. So if we're looking therefore at the notion of a collective amount of harm in a community, In this particular case, I assigned it each pedestrian stop and traffic stop quite a small number on the score, but as a demonstration, if we include in this measure of harm in communities, what you can see is that that can be added to this collective harm index for a hotspot, for a small neighborhood, for a police district. When we look at this, what we can see is that if we were just measuring part 1 crime, congratulations to the district captain in this area, because if we just put a linear scale on that in part 1 crime, violent crime goes down. However, if we look at the harm index, even more kudos to the captain in this area, because overall harm decreases by a greater rate. Now compare that to another district, real data from another district in Philadelphia. They have a higher total of part 1 crime, so that it's a little bit higher here. We add in part 2 crime, and part 2 crime has that sort of general decreasing trend. Traffic accidents as well. And then finally add in this other measure of pedestrian stops. And what we can see is something a little bit different. Part 1 crime goes down over the course of 10 years. Add a linear projection to the total harm score, and it actually increases. Harm from the community's perspective actually increases over that period of time. And it's mainly, if you see from about 2008, you can see a significant increase in the number of pedestrian stops in that area. Now again, I'm coming back to this notion of, I'm not necessarily saying that pedestrian stops are harmful, though there is some evidence starting to emerge about on an individual's, the public health impacts of excessive numbers of interactions with the police. But I think it's interesting to think about this in terms of ways of thinking about the collective harm in a community. And police departments might want to think about this, because are the gains that are had in terms of reducing crime satisfactory compared to the possible offset in terms of loss of legitimacy by increasing something that has a possibly modest but yet still iatrogenic sort of effect on communities. Now you might have to change the different weightings, but it may be a way to think about looking at the collective activity of police departments. Where might this be useful? Well, we might want to also include in this kind of thing public health and drug overdoses. Drug overdoses in communities might be a way to think about focusing narcotics units not on the number of drug arrests from a drug market, but how harmful that drug market is. Founded police complaints might be built into that. It might be a way to understand the cross-border of offenders, and I'm going to show you that as my second example in a moment, because it's not just about which offenders live in your community, but which offenders are outside your community who are coming in to commit crime. How you deal with those might be very different than you deal with offenders who live and commit crime in your community. If they're from outside, the community is much more likely to support interdiction by the police. If they're from inside the community might be more enthusiastic about different types of less enforcement-related solutions. There are all sorts of pieces about this that still remain to be thought about. Should we give additional weighting to repeat victimization? And temporal considerations. There's all sorts of time series analysis we could do with this kind of stuff. I don't want to get all wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey on you.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
The operationalization of this has a lot of challenges still ahead of it, but it does build in that collective sense of harm, and I think it gives a holistic view of harm, not crime. I think it's a capacity to think about harm in places, by building in much more of the activity that's in the area. And it actually helps in terms if we think about evaluations. We're quite good now, as the evaluators and the researchers in the room can measure spatial crime displacement, but not so good at assessing the nature of crime type displacement, whether offenders are staying in the community but committing different types of crime. And having one collective measure looking at the whole crime and harm as a system actually also gets around some statistical issues with the experiment-wise error correction rate. Okay, that's one way we can think about it. Let's think a little bit more about offenders for this. What we've done, I've actually taken this is an ordinal scale, and we've translated it across to the recommended sentence in months for first offences, and that takes our ordinal scale and makes it much more of an interval scale. And I'd like you to remember the colour bars here, because the colour bars become really important next. So what we have here is these around from sort of 7 or 8 downwards. The offences are bunched down with much more lower penalties, and a few up at the top here get much more serious penalties. And we can chart this for each offender. So this is taking one police district in Philadelphia and looking at all the offenders and all the offences. What we have here is the age of the offender. Each bubble is going to represent one offender. We have their collective harm score. So the higher up the scale, the more harmful in overall is our offender. And the colour of each circle represents the harm score for the most serious offence for that offender. So if they committed 10 offences, we'll look at the most serious one, and that indicates the colour. And what we can see is that we have an interesting sort of description of essentially all of the offenders who commit crime in the district or live in this police district. I've taken out a number of the offenders who have 2 or 3 incidents, so we're just looking at repeat offenders who've committed 3 or 4 or more crimes. And what we see is that we've got this guy up here who's about 21 years old. This is based on 5 years worth of arrest data. And this has got everybody in it. It's got people who live outside the area and commit crime in the district, people who live in the district, commit crime in the district, and people who live in the district and commit crime outside. And we have this one offender up here with a massive harm score. Green suggests that his most serious offence is moderate to fairly serious. And he's far ahead of these guys here in red, who they have fewer offences, but their offences are more serious. If we just exclude him, because he's essentially driving the chart to be very squashed. So if we just look at this area here and expand that out, we can see something interesting here. We have this one offender here, this blue giant here, whose harm score, he'd probably never come to the notice of police if you were looking for violent repeat offenders. Because his blue score, he doesn't do violent crime. He commits non-violent crime, but the size of the circle indicates he commits a hell of a lot of it. And in actual fact, his harm is greater than many of these smaller red circles down here. If we just decide to look at incidents within the district, so this is probably what a district captain would be concerned about, the crime in my district. Who are the people in my district committing crime, and who are the people from outside coming into my district to commit crime? What we see is a different picture here. I'm going to call these 2 little dots at the top here. Nobody's going to get this. I'm going to call these guys Lister and Crichton, because if that's a blue giant over there, these are 2 red dwarfs. And only people from Britain are going to get that. All right. Expanding on that a little bit, taking those guys out, we now see much more of a spread. And at least as a starting point for thinking about who the police should give their love and attention to. If we have limited resources for surveillance, for interdiction, to think about even community-based solutions to problems, we really might be thinking about these people here. They're quite young, they're serious on the harm score, but you see there's a mix of offences in there. It's not all violent offenders, but there are people who are committing a lot of harm to the community and having a damaging impact on community health. And so what you have with this is some robbers and some violent offenders up there, but you see this other group who are committing as much harm on this metric as others. Other ways to think about this, and this is where it might be relevant, especially in terms of thinking about solutions for small crime areas, for hotspots, for crime at places, which is something that the Police Foundation is very focused on, and David Weisbird is helping to lead the charge and have people think about this, is that we can also distinguish these by whether people come from outside or whether they live in the district. So, for example, squares in this case indicate people who live outside the district but commit crime in the district. The circles are the people who live in the district and commit crime at home. What we end up with is some of the most serious in terms of harmful offenders live outside the district, but many of the violent offenders live in the district. Thinking about these things gives the opportunity of thinking different ways about solutions. As I said before, if you live in the community may be more willing to discuss different types of deterrence. If you live outside, they may be more encouraging and supportive of police who want to do more enforcement, focus, and that kind of activity. So, looking at this, where I like this, it allows us to incorporate more of an offender's criminal history. We're focused very much on serious repeat violent offenders, but if anybody's looked through criminal histories, you'll know that offenders are generalists on the whole, they don't specialize, and by doing so we miss a lot of that actual harmful behavior. Think of the little girl, she is unlikely to be the victim of a shooting or violent crime. She's much more likely to have somebody steal her car, break into her home, and the emotional harm of that is not necessarily caused by people who are red circles. It blends the violent and the non-violent harms, and it is about people's behavior. I don't think this is the end of analysis. I think this is a starting point. If I was in a police district, I would want to be thinking about bringing in other sources of information about gang behavior, and possibly even about mental health and behavioral health issues if that information is available. But at least as a starting point, as a triage mechanism, it might be really helpful to think about the nature. You might even have the structure of harm profiles for police districts and crime hotspots, depending on whether you have a few serious repeat offenders or lots of low-level offenders committing different crimes of opportunity. I'm going to finish off by talking about one more piece of work. This is a bit more unusual. Working with the FBI on a national project. Their lovely headquarters there, designed by the same people that seem to design tower blocks in the East End of London. They all went to the Brutalist School of Architecture. Thanks very much for that. Can't wait to knock it down. Working with these guys has been great. We had the opportunity to travel around, and credit to the FBI for going out and getting ahead of this issue. Thinking of their focus now, especially for their gang units and the violent crime threat section, thinking about the community impact of the work that they do. Moving away from traditional measures of here's a pile of money and drugs and guns we put on the table, but instead thinking what is the work that we do in terms of interdicting violent street gangs and what is the benefit to the community. And so to credit to them, because this is a concern from the White House, the Office of Management and Budget, and they're trying to get ahead of this. And the starting point for that is thinking to some degree, and this is the project that's still underway, what are the harms that gangs cause? We know they commit crime, but what are some of the other impacts that they cause? And I've had the opportunity to travel the country, spend time going around, speaking to members of gang task forces around the country. And the value of that has been they have an insight, especially with the FBI's projects, they have an insight that you can't really get somewhere else. They listen to wiretaps, they have proffers, they speak to confidential informants. They have a much better sense of the myriad ways that communities are harmed and the legitimacy of government is undermined by gangs. They see a much more three-dimensional picture that you can get from many other places. And so what's going to happen with this is we hope to be able to build from essentially a gang harm index. And from this, think about moving forward to different criteria for measuring and assessing which gangs are going to deserve the FBI's love and attention. Based not just on their capacity to commit crime, but characteristics such as how much intimidation they commit in the neighborhood, how audacious are some of their crimes. The impact of those is a bit similar to Martin Innes's work in the United Kingdom about signal crimes, crimes that have a far greater impact on public perception of crime because of their audacious nature or because they come to many more people's notice. Generational, how difficult it is to interdict gangs based on the fact that they're family generations, and it's hard for people and young people in those gangs to escape the gang because their grandfather's in the gang and their father's in the gang and their mother's in the gang and their nephews and nieces are in the gang, and how difficult that is and how much that destroys the fabric of neighborhoods. The capacity of the gang to engage in retaliation or to damage the economic infrastructure in the community, how much they recruit, work in schools, how much they try different types of crime, and their capacity to switch from one crime type to another that makes it difficult to interdict against them, but also makes it difficult to limit the harm they cause in communities. And where I see all this coming then is that this focus on harm is not a tactic in itself. It's a way to think about prioritizing some of those other tactics, such as problem-oriented policing and intelligence-led policing, from an evidential base, to believe that hype that we're talking about a future that's harm-focused, intelligence-led, problem-oriented, and evidence-based. because we know we have to move to this. The next 10, 20 years of policing will have to move that way, because we've shown again and again that the standard model of policing doesn't work. And if any of you are confused as to what the standard model of policing is, rather than go for the academic discussion, I thought I would demonstrate it that this is essentially what you spend your career in policing doing. You come out of the academy and then you spend the rest of your career essentially doing this. And spend 30 years just taking out whichever idiot sticks his head above the parapet, and then eventually after 20 or 30 years, there you go. Eventually you have a retirement party, a couple of glasses of whiskey, and you get a watch or a cuddly toy in this particular case. Good for you, sir. Good for you. All right. Am I talking about expansion of the role in policing? I don't think I am. What I think I'm really arguing for here is greater recognition, and this is a complaint that I hear in many police departments and districts, that the officers want greater recognition for the range of activities that they undertake, rather than just the focus on violent crime. Notwithstanding that that's seriously important, I don't dispute that. But if you remember back to my 100 squares, it's better to have a measure that reflects the good work of officers and the harms in departments, and allows them to think about shifting metrics. Perhaps they need to focus more on burglary. Perhaps it's more of an issue in a department, in a district or a crime hotspot, even though there's violent crime. And I don't think that's an outrageous expansion, because I was reading the work of these guys, who are writing the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. And imagine the irony. Here's me, English, live 4 blocks from Independence Hall, pay taxes, and I can't vote. And I was also drawn by, quite surprised at the number of Nazi sympathizers there were in colonial times. Took me by surprise, I must admit. But in the very first sentence of the preamble of the Constitution, they wrote about a more perfect union, though that's difficult to establish, that establishes justice, and that's fine. But the piece I've highlighted here is to promote the general welfare. And as the nature of policing changes, and violent crime is still far higher than it has to be, and it's much higher than it should be, the nature of policing is changing. I don't think that limits the role of police. I think we need greater recognition of the value of police and the necessity of police in our communities to promote the general welfare. And that's maybe why I hope for this little girl, in the next 20 years or so, she'll see that the police in her neighborhood are, and the policing in her neighborhood is harm-focused, intelligence-led, problem-oriented, and evidence-based. Thank you.